Hello and welcome to our presentation on the so-called Auden Group of poets. First, I'm going to introduce you to the Auden Group by explaining how it was formed and what the main ideals of this group was. After that, Sophie will explain the major historic events during the 1930s which influenced the writings of the Auden Group poets. Lastly, Noah will analyze one poem of Auden as an example. Now to our first point. The Auden Group is a name given by scholars to a collection of writers, musicians, and painters who are described as a post-war generation with some idealistic connections to the poet Winston Hugh Auden. You can see Auden on the slide. As already mentioned, the name was given by scholars as this group was not actively formed by its members. In fact, some of the members of the Auden Group never even met each other. It is also known that no one who was categorized as a member called themselves member of the Auden Group. Even Auden himself dismissed the existence of the Auden Group. The connection of these various artists was rather formed by their similar literary styles. Another similarity of the members included that most of them were Oxford University graduates. They were characterized by a main left-centered political stance and an ethos of sexual dissidence in some areas. Hence, the style of the Auden Group in the 1930s differed from the literary style of the 1920s, in which floridly experimental literary styles were prevalent. The reason why the rather imagined group was called after the poet Auden is because he was seen as a central figure for the writings in the 1930s. And the members of the group are known to have shared ideals as Auden. All in all, it is difficult to call this group an actual group, as it was unofficial, without real memberships or meetings. However, it was a group of writers with similar ideals to the central figure in writing, which was Auden. The most well-known central members of the Auden Group were Christopher Isherwood, Louis MacNeice, and C. Day Lewis, Edward Upward, John Lanman, and in non-literary aspects, the musician Benjamin Britten and painter William Coldstream. Even though the group wasn't known to have any meetings under the name Auden Group, there were collaborations between some of the artists. Especially Auden and Isherwood are known to have made many collaborations in writing. Themes of the writing, which was affiliated with the Auden Group, included mythic, practical, and notional phases, which resulted from the political situations and traumas of the 1930s. These important historical issues will be explained further in the following part.
Alright, now that you know something about the Auden Group in general, I would like to give you a little historical overview of what happened during the poets' lifetimes, as the 30s were a really eventful decade. Some of those events still have an impact on global history today. Let me start with the Great Depression. The Great Depression is considered the worst economic disaster of the 20th century. It was so serious that even historians and economists today are not sure how the crisis could have been coped with best. The trigger event for the Great Depression was the Wall Street crash on the 24th of October 1929, a date which we now know as Black Friday. From this day on, banks in the US were collapsing and the unemployment rate increased dramatically. Therefore, the trade with Europe decreased. And this is how the Great Depression had a worldwide impact. This event considerably lowered the living standards in the 1930s. And though the UK recovered around 1932, there were growing social and political crises in the rest of Europe. For example, the failure of democracy, which leads us to the next fateful event. As the world grappled with the aftermath of the Great Depression, the rise of fascism cast a dark shadow over Europe. In the German elections of 1933, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which we also know as NSDAP, secured a staggering 43.9% of the votes. On the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed the German Reich Chancellor by President Paul von Hindenburg. By using violence, intimidation, and strategies of political suppression and prohibitions, the Nazis eliminated democracy within a shockingly short period of time and established their malign, horrible regime of terror that would, in the following years, push the world to the brink of the abyss and cost millions of innocent lives. But not only in Germany fascism was on the rise. There were also fascist regimes in Japan and in Italy under Benito Mussolini. Together, those three regimes formed an alliance known as the Axis, which actively supported other fascist movements like the one in Spain. This support would eventually lead to the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War, spanning from 1936 to 1939, was a fierce ideological conflict. Right-wing army officers, led by Francisco Franco, sought to overthrow the left-wing Spanish government. However, the nationalists under Franco were facing strong resistance within the Spanish population. Germany and Italy then decided to support the nationalists. The government was backed by the Soviets. German and Italian troops were sent to Spain, where they would slaughter civilians in the most brutal ways, for example by bombing civilian targets with Air Force units. They also sent tank divisions. The bombing of civilian targets was of particular interest to Great Britain, as it stoked the fear that in a future war, these tactics could be used to break the civilian morale, which they considered as a crucial component to win a war, as the civilians needed to support the war efforts. Of course, all of this did not leave the poets of the Auden Group unaffected. And then came September 1st, 1939, a day that plunged the world into another devastating conflict, the beginning of the Second World War. Germany, driven by Hitler's expansionist ambitions, invaded Poland. Britain and France swiftly entered the war on September 3rd. This global conflict, being the first to involve all major powers, would claim the lives of approximately 70 million people between 1939 and 1945. When on the 8th of May, Germany finally surrendered, as almost all of its territory was occupied by Allied forces. On this day, the Second World War, at least in Europe, was over. When the war started, W. H. Auden tried to find the right words to express the fears he and many others shared, and I would like to end my part with some powerful lines from his poem September 1st, 1939. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. And on this dark note, over to Noah and the poem analysis.
Let us come to an analysis of one of Auden's poems now. The poem we will be looking at is called Funeral Blues and was written down in the year 1936. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking for juicy bone, silence the pianos and with muffled drum bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. Let aeroplanes circle moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky the message, he is dead. Put crab bows around the white necks of the public dogs, let the traffic policemen wear black cotton gloves. He was my north, my south, my east, my west, my working week and my Sunday rest. My noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now. Put out everyone. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good. We chose this poem because even though Auden went through several artistic stages throughout his life, his ability to capture the imperfectness of human love that strikes the reader to the core and offer them relief from the chaotic and broken world around them is a constant factor of his poetry. Despite Auden's distant suspicion of personal emotion and private love, he can still create heart-wrenching poems like Our Funeral Blues. The poem lets us into the world of a lover whose emotions of grief over the death of his loved one are so vividly expressed by Auden. Before diving into a verse-by-verse analysis, let us first discuss the structure and some stylistic devices used by Auden. Funeral Blues contains 4 4-line stanzas, also known as quatrains, which all follow a regular pattern of 2 rhyming couplets per stanza, up until the last stanza, where an irregular couplet is paired again with a rhyming one. For meters, we find a free verse, which with irregular patterns of syllables and stress, symbolizing the emotional turmoil inside the narrator. For stylistic devices, the repetition of the third stanza immediately catches our eye, as well as the parallelism of the verses structure of the first 3 verses of this third stanza. Here you can also find 2 alliterations with working week and my midnight. Furthermore, Auden uses caesura in the 4th verse of stanzas 1 and 3. In verse 1 of the 2nd stanza, we additionally find a personification of aeroplanes by describing the sound of the engines as moaning. Hyperboles are also found in Funeral Blues. For example, in verse 2 of the last stanza, the lyrical I demands that the sun not only disappear out of his sight, but he calls to dismantle it altogether, ceasing its existence entirely. Now let us have a more detailed look at the 4 stanzas. In the first stanza, the lyrical I demands total silence by stopping the ticking of the clocks, as well as the ringing of telephones and barking of dogs. Stop all the clocks could also be a reference to the emotions of the lyrical I, because without its lever, time seems to be standing still. Pianos aren't allowed to play because their beautiful sounds are not welcome here. Only the muffled drums are announcing the march of the pallbearers who bring in the coffin. The caesura in the 4th verse evokes the impression that total silence has been achieved and only now are the mourners allowed to come. The 2nd stanza continues to build up the mood of despair the lyrical I feels by introducing sound in the silence that was gained in the first stanza. Now the only thing that fills the air is the moaning sounds of the aeroplanes and the grim announcement of death. Because of this all-encompassing sadness, every living being and institution has to acknowledge the tragic loss of the lyrical I by wearing appropriate clothes, no matter if they are a commandant or a traffic policeman. The 3rd stanza tells us more about the past lover and what he meant to the lyrical I. Kind of like a speech at the funeral. Simply put, they were everything to them. Every direction, every day of the week, every song and every talk. So a love that encompasses every corner of the world, every second spent on this earth, and every joy that is to be had on God's creation. The parallelism of the verse structure, as well as the repetition of my, lets us feel like there's no end to the love that is felt by the lyrical I. However, the sobering last verse of the stanza reminds us that this endless love is no more. Auden shocks the reader with this gut punch of a verse and leaves them in the same disbelief the lyrical I is experiencing. The 4th and last stanza is not only the end of the poem, but also demands the end of everything. Now silence is not good enough for the lyrical I. Everything has to go. Because without its lover, the world has lost all its worth and nothing can come good to any good anymore. All beauty is not wanted anymore. The shining moon and stars, the bright sun, as well as the vast oceans and deep green woods. Everything has to end because nothing was and never will be more valuable than the love for this past lover. This is also the end of our presentation. Here you can see our sources and the sources for the pictures we used. And we thank you for your attention. Have a nice rest of your day.